I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Seth Meyer. Seth just recently left his role as a USDA chief economist to return to the University of Missouri. So for the last few weeks, he's been settling in as the new director for the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute. FAPRI is well-known for its agricultural policy and market analysis, often being called upon by Congress and the USDA. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Meyer to the stage.
Thank you.
Farmers we talk to feel under pressure right now. As an economist, how do you view the Midwest agriculture today, and can you compare it to some time or context?
Well, I think there's probably two contexts right off the top of my head. The first thing I'll say is, if you look back over the last 15 or 20 years, we've had 3 price spikes, right? So we get these jumps in output prices. They're followed by a run-up in input prices. Farmers do what they're very good at, which is correct supplies in that tight market, and yet so commodity prices decline, and yet input prices remain sticky. So when you look back at the last 3 price spikes, output prices jump, input prices follow, commodity prices go down, and yet input prices are sticky, and you end up with a period of very tight margins. And I think when people ask me, well, when is this going to be over? I don't know the answer to that, because it's usually some unknown shock in the last 20 years that brings us back out of it. And so when you look at that, you go back and you go, well, from 2014 to 2019, we had very poor and narrow margins. 2 years ago, I was giving a speech in Washington, D.C., and I expressed my concern with how quickly margins are narrowing, okay? And then to kind of put it in another the point is margins are poor on the crop side. The economy and the farm sector is poor, and there's no obvious spark that gets you out of that quickly. And we can talk about biofuel policy and what contribution that can make. And then that brings me to my other context, which is, we produced a 17 billion bushel crop this year, over 17 billion bushels. We're supposed to export 3.2 billion bushels of that crop. We've never exported more than 3 billion bushels of corn, and yet we're going to blow through that at 3.2 billion bushels. I think back in the early 2000s when I was doing my policy work and we're saying, boy, we're building up a lot of corn. We're going to need to find an export market for 3 billion bushels. We never got there, but we're going to need to do that. And then along came biofuel policy, sucked that up. And so for 2 decades, we haven't talked about that kind of an export campaign. And sure, this year it's because it's a big crop is part of it. But you look out future and you can see that large supply that you need to do something with. So not sure there's an immediate catalyst that solves everything today. And the next spark that comes along will either be something which builds over time or a shock that we don't know.
Thinking about corn and soybeans, what should give hope to farmers in 2026, and what should cause more sleepless nights?
So I think that this will probably touch on some of your other discussions going forward. So what should be optimistic? Well, what does soybean exports actually end up looking like? We saw, hey, if we do get a spark on the demand side, we saw the last couple days. Now we'll find out if those soybeans actually move in the way the president alluded to China. We're going to export a fair amount of corn, a record crop. So optimistic. This is going to sound really horrible, but I don't think we're going to go much lower than we are now today. That's not an optimistic sign, right? But we've hit this point, and maybe we build some demand even without the spark. Okay, so we get ourselves in, price does a little bit of the work. And then sleepless, do we have some other kind of disruption? Do we have something else which disrupts the supply chain? Do we have some animal disease outbreak that really crushes domestic demand or foreign demand for our product? So I think from a purely economic standpoint in terms of net returns, I think we've got room to make some improvements with some building of demand. But I think that there's always those black swans out there that you have to worry about, and you got to look for ways to build underlying demand.
What do you want the farmers to know about the USDA's long-term outlook?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the long-term outlook that the USDA just published, I think we were talking about it earlier today, which is first of all, it doesn't assume any policy change, right? So you don't look at that and you say, when we've got that price for corn that's out there that's pretty flat going forward, it doesn't assume any of the policies that you all are pushing, that you all are advocating for. It assumes policies which exist today. So that's the base, and I think that that's a good way to look at it, which is, you know, the analysis that USDA puts out in that assumes policy in place, and therefore that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a very flat, and maybe that is often been the norm of the last 20 years of very modest margins. So what do I want to know about? What do you know about the baseline? You do things to change that demand, perhaps, and otherwise, crops in the United States is going to continue to grow. We did 186 bushel an acre this year. That was a big crop. You got to find something to do with all that grain.
You're not in the government anymore, so give us a straight scoop. Tariffs and farmers, how's it working out?
I think what's important here is that I don't think ag's not the driver in this discussion as well, too. But unfortunately, I think ag is the part that's getting moved around in this process. I think there's lots of other debates with the Chinese, with other countries on what trade deals look like, and ag, not an afterthought, but not the main driver of this. I think when you think about all of the other things that we are engaging with China on in trade debates, so unfortunately, I think we can say, hey, we need some resolution, and a lot of that resolution on trade sits outside of the ag sector, but you got to make sure everyone knows that this isn't pleasant for the ag sector as we're trying to come to some resolution. So I guess the question is one that we'll have to talk about next year, which is, does this end up someplace? Where does this end up? If you end up with solving these issues outside of ag, this can be good for ag. You know, maybe you solve some of these issues with China, maybe that facilitates a better action. If you don't resolve these issues with China, ag is the one that's going to be on the hook for the disruptions. And I think that applies the same when it comes to other potential from these trade deals where ag is saying, hey, you're talking to India. There's certainly an opportunity for us. You're talking to Southeast Asia. There's an opportunity for us. So the question is, are the tariffs for tariff's sake, or are they to achieve some end goal? So we'll find out. And the truth is when you're negotiating on this, no one else should know other than the negotiator. If they knew that that's the end goal, then that changes the strategy. Right. So let's come back in a year and let's see where we end up. And this audience is incredibly quiet when I'm saying these things, so it's a bit unnerving. You guys I'll accept noises of disagreement as well, too.
Can you talk about the farmer bridge aid? What is driving it, and what's the goal there?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one. So even before this, China is an important market, and it's an uncomfortable market at the same time, right? And so even before the change in administration, the Office of the Chief Economist had been working on ways to think about or measure or look at trade disruption aid. It is the Office of the Chief Economist that did MFP1 and MFP2 under the first initial trade friction with China. And so we already had in our mind, you know, this is going to come to a head again. Let's be prepared. And so we spent a lot of time doing trade aid, but then you also have an underlying economic problem within the ag sector, right? And so to some extent, you know, if you focused solely on trying to measure trade impacts, you'd leave out a lot of commodities that are in fact having difficulty, right? Let's just take rice. We don't trade rice with China, and so if you're doing purely trade aid, the rice folks might not get very much, okay? But are the rice folks seeing a big decline in their returns? Absolutely they are. So, you know, when we think about farmer bridge assistance and the way that came together, I think its design was intended to both be, I think it was an understanding not that this isn't trade aid, this is a more broad economic aid, and that we need to deliver it quickly. So it used some of the same formulas that we might have seen in ECAP, just because systems are set up, designs are set up, economic disruptions for the sector are very widespread. And so it was a formula in my mind for speed of delivery. And they call it a bridge assistance specifically because when you look out into some of the other program payments like ARC and PLC, those are going to show up in October. So the question is between February 28th and October is a stretch for which there's unknown.
Treasury just released guidance on the 45Z Clean Fuel Program tax credits. What was good and what was bad for the farmers?
So for the farmers, I think that they do benefit indirectly through clarifications for biofuel producers and upstream into retail. What was a bit disappointing to me is the reference to the USDA program of providing some producer practices incentive back to producers, because to me that was the way that the producers could attempt to capture some value of the credit, right? If they're able to generate a certain reduction in CI score, they could take their paper and they could go to the biofuel folks and negotiate for some share of the benefit that would be derived from that. So I tell you this, and this is, so my disappointment is there, and I think if you read the language, you see this word, which is intend. We intend to. And I was joking with somebody that, if my wife says, I need you to get eggs at the store tonight, and if I reply, I intend to do that, that's not going to be something that is really builds a lot of confidence in her that I'm going to do that this evening when I get home. And so when I see this intend, it's better than no mention of it. But let's back up a little bit and say, let's remind that this is not an administration thing, that the USDA, the 45Z tax credits were passed under the formulation of this was passed under the last administration. Mm-hmm. The folks at Treasury, we proposed something. The folks at Treasury basically said, if you want it, you do it, USDA. And my office is not large, and we write a regulation about once every 20 years. And we said, fine, we'll do it. We'll do it. As if somehow this was a threat. Oh, if you want it so bad, you go do it. No, well, fine, we'll go do it. And so we put together this rule, and we put out our preliminary rule. That preliminary rule has the force of law, and this is important in that. And then we also said, we'll take comments. We got a lot of really great comments back from producers, a lot of really great comments. And for us, it's mostly a facilitation. How do we facilitate in a really economically feasible way that producers can do these practices, get some share of the credit, the producer of the fuel gets some share of the credit, and it actually flows back down. At least some of it flows back down, especially in the environment we're talking about in terms of poor economic margins. And I know, I heard some folks saying, if you can capture 10 cents at a 2.85 conversion of gallons per bushel, that's, an extra 28 cents a bushel to negotiate over now. That's not bad if you can come up with some share of that. So we put out a preliminary rule. We went on and addressed all of and had great support from the last administration and this administration in continuing our work. And so we put a lot of effort into addressing the producers' concerns, getting everything in order, and really kind of putting out there a really solid concept. So I hope that they feel as much pressure at Treasury and DOE to get those eggs as I do, right? And that intend is not something which slips by. I'm not a fan of the word intend, right? Give me something a bit more. They could have referenced our preliminary rule because it has the effect of law at USDA. It had the effect of law. They could have referenced it, but they didn't. So I think that USDA has been out in front of this the whole time.
Trade, tariffs, RFS, E15, 45Z, the list goes on. Discuss some of the horse trading within the administration.
Yeah, and so I think that, and I think that that's a lot of, I read the news like you all do, and so you've got all of these components, and I think it is very difficult for people to wrap their heads around all of these bits and pieces of horse trading going on. And now we've got kind of 45Z is, I think, essentially off the table for this horse trading that's going on in the near term. But you look at these components of the RVO, making some changes, reductions to the RVO, half RIN credits. I mean, to me, that's a very big deal that is difficult for people to wrap their heads around, because what else has to change in the reg to facilitate those half RIN credits? And you could see a lot of changes in the volume depending upon how they handle that if they pull that back. So that's a big deal. And then we talk about small refinery exemptions. And I think people rightfully are concerned about small refinery exemptions going forward. But I'll remind them that this RVO is only for 26 and 27. And the real discussion is about all the past RINs they want to dump into the market. That's where the real volume is. And so when I read these pieces of legislation, it's often very vague about reallocation, because that's the volumes that matter. And so when I look about and then you have E15 sitting out there as well too. And so when you layer that over the top of it, it changes some of the impact. And I think that there is horse trading going on about these three pieces of the RVO and the E15 piece all coming together. And it's hard for people to understand the relative importance and making sure that the quality of those two horses that they are trading are of equal quality.
I would agree. A recent study here in Iowa has found that rapid adoption of E15, if allowed, could help firm up corn prices for several years. But ultimately, even bigger markets like marine and SAF would be needed. What's your take?
Yeah, so I think there's been a huge range of estimates about E15 expansion. Okay, and I might be a middle of the road kind of person. Maybe not as high as some people expect in terms of how quickly this adoption occurs, but maybe faster than folks like the Congressional Budget Office do. And that's not, I mean, folks will say, well, who cares what the Congressional Budget Office thinks about this? But it's not irrelevant, because if expansion occurs and corn prices rise, that means lower ARC and PLC payments, and that means government savings. Government savings. There's less money put into those safety net programs if you increase the price of it. So even the CBO's score on E15 matters. Even their view on this going forward matters. So when I look at that, I might be a bit more middle of the road on this aspect of it, but I think also you add some flexibility into the RFS system. That kind of a flexibility, I'm an economist. That kind of flexibility is always appealing to me in terms of dealing with shocks. If you have E15, you have some flexibility in the system. You can do the necessary changes between biodiesel and ethanol and gasoline prices. You can make those kinds of adjustments. So it has a lot of appeal for that. And you had a second part to your question, and I've passed it over. What was the second part?
Bigger markets like marine, SAF are needed. What's your take?
So what's my take? I think it's important, and I apologize, just coming from government, I take this from a very government perspective, which is, I'm going to give you a bit of a background story when it comes to the International Civil Aviation Organization, so ICAO, okay? And I also used to work at the FAO in Rome. So I'm telling you this for a reason, which is, you know, when you get to these bigger international organizations, they make a point to say, okay, you are now no longer from your country, you are meeting the needs of this organization. I think Americans are the ones that take that most seriously. Because when I was in ICAO, driven by FAA, and maybe they don't think as much about ag, they got a lot on their plate. When I think about the Brazilians and their moves into ICAO, they were very good and very political about doing what they wanted to do. And when we raised a complaint about something, the Brazilians came to talk to me. Half the people there were politicals, not scientists, when this was supposed to be a scientific and economic discussion, but half the people there were politicals, not. And so I think as Americans, we always say, okay, we're gonna adhere to this. This is not a nationalistic discussion. This is a science discussion. And yet we see other countries playing in there. And it's important for us to do that, because in this latest ICAO discussion the problem I was bringing with them was they had gotten to the point where second crop corn in Brazil, so right now they're harvesting the beans and they're planting the corn. They had gotten to the point where they had convinced everybody that this corn, second crop corn, fell from the sky like a gift and had no environmental impacts, nor does this revenue from this crop incentivize the conversion of land at all. And that anything that was bad going on in this land was on the soybeans. Okay, then you compared that to the US farmers, and they were getting all of the whatever impacts were going to the crop and an indirect land use charge for land Brazil was converting. So the Brazilian corn was getting no indirect charge, and US land was getting a charge for indirect land use in Brazil. And so I think that it behooved us in ag to start sticking our fingers into those parts of the system that we hadn't been a party to. And I think this is incredibly important when it comes to the IMO, the maritime organizations, because they will head down that same path. And if ag doesn't stay engaged, we will find the Brazilians stealing our lunch money again.
I would agree.
Right?
I would agree. The current administrations have made it very clear that they're not concerned about carbon emissions. But some new market opportunities for renewable fuels around the world are driven by carbon policies elsewhere. How should farmers try to bridge that divide?
Sell your customers what they want. I mean, it's that simple. If they want it, then do it. If you can facilitate a way to sell them what they want, then sell it to them, right? You shouldn't say, you know, I'm going to impose what I think on you as a customer. Customer wants it, sell the customer that. And so this goes back to the part about ICAO and IMO as well too, right? You may say, parts of the, and I think it's parts of the administration may say, no, at the end of the day, we think the motivation for this is we don't believe in that motivation. But at the same time, if the people you want to sell to do, then you better be there to shape that framework in a way that doesn't disadvantage you and is legitimate, right? And don't let the Brazilians put their policy on you and the politics on you. You got to play the game as well.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. What signals do you watch most closely to assess the health of the rural economies in 2026 and beyond?
In 2026 and beyond, the health of the rural economy. Probably back of the envelope. And see, we got to divide this up into a few pieces as well too, which is USDA put out their farm income statement today. And you see, first of all, a whole bunch of payments coming from things like ad hoc disaster assistance, ARC and PLC, and farmer bridge assistance. And so look, there's money being injected to this, and yet and yet when you think about just on the cash receipts and the input side, that's a money loser. So I think for me, when I'm looking at the overall health of this, I'm kind of going back to what is the market giving you and what is the market charging you? And that's going to tell me quite a bit about where I think we're headed in the short run. And right now I think we've also got a very different, you look at these aggregates and people talk about the aggregates and they look at farm income. Cow-calf producers probably doing pretty good. Now, not enough to turn the cattle cycle for you folks out there. I'm really looking for this. You didn't turn the cattle cycle in the latest report. But, the livestock side of this faring better and the row crop producers faring worse. And when you aggregate them together, it doesn't look quite as bad, right? But the row crop producers, I look at margins, I look at what it's done over the last couple years, and that's kind of my indicator. I think a lot of the other interventions muddy that signal. Right? It's like, I think when we look at farmer bridge assistance, that does kick the can down the road a little bit, right?
I agree.
But what's the underlying change? What's the underlying motivation? What's the underlying demand? What's the underlying export market? That's important because right now I think we're getting other signals that are muddying that. You're getting noise that you're trying to peel that signal off.
Farmers get frustrated when the USDA reports miss either the acres or the yield. Some even suggest the timing is designed to push prices down to impact support levels. Having seen the inside, how are you going to respond?
Yeah, so I think that, so I used to lead my first time at I just left my second time at USDA. The first time I was at USDA, I ran one of these two groups that's in lockup that produces these monthly reports that gives producers a lot of anxiety. And I will tell you, my phone, we did this every month, my phone rang about half the time. You know what I mean by half the time? If prices go up, the phone didn't ring. Prices went down, the phone rang. And so I'm quite used to this in terms of, I think if folks, I don't like missing. I don't like being wrong. okay? I never liked, we were always trying to figure out how we could do our job better. But that tells you that it is important for it is important for USDA to convey and be transparent and to improve and point out what they might be doing differently. I think the big shock this year was the June acreage report, quite honestly. If I can spend just a few minutes on this, I think that was probably the miss, the June acreage report. I think the last time we had this number of corn acres was 2012, or near this number of corn acres was 2012. So I have lots of questions about how did we miss? And I think that USDA needs to, should, will go back and evaluate that miss. It needs to. It needs to build some confidence back with folks and say, hey, either, it was such an unusual year, here's what we're going to do, here's why, here's what we're going to have to do. And I know that they will do that. And we got the Ag Outlook Forum coming up in a couple weeks in Washington, D.C., so I expect that to be a big source of discussion. They'll put out their thoughts for acreage for the next coming year. And I'm sure the question will be, how did you come up with that June acreage report? Or do you still like that yield? I will note, though, that a lot of folks said that the yield of 188.8 was fantasy. And now they came back and said 186. Now, you still may not believe that. But it's not. It was clearly a quite good year for yields.
How significant are renewable fuels, ethanol, biodiesel, to stabilizing demand for U.S. corn, soybeans, and other feedstocks?
And so I think that there are not so many. We talked about this early on. There's not in this last year. When I was at USDA, there are not so many policy levers that can be thrown, which change things right away. Mm-hmm. I think biofuels is maybe one of the ones where there's some action. Now, again, I told you I'm a middle of the road kind of person when it comes through to E15. That this is not a today solution, but it does have some demand potential longer run. Okay, RVO, there's another demand issue. We will continue to produce more crops. Our yields are improving. We don't have area to expand, but the Brazilians do. Okay, they're going to produce, South America is going to produce almost 240 million metric tons of soybeans this year. Okay, so there is you either need to wait for really low prices to create their own demand, or you have to think about what other demand markets are out there. So I do think that when we look longer run, you're going to have to look for those kinds of sparks. It isn't obvious to me. Chinese demand, perhaps longer run, we won't see the kind of growth we've seen year over year in terms of, say, soybean imports over the last 2 decades. Where are we going to come up with that? We're going to see our yields increase. We're going to see our productivity increase. And so we need to find something to do with all that.
Very good.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.